Hey, we're glad that you're here today. Glad you're hanging out with us. We are continuing in this series that we've been in for a while on the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible and arguably probably the most controversial book in the New Testament. Revelation is actually a letter that is written to 7 churches at the end of the first century. And these 7 churches all exist in what is like modern day Turkey. Sometimes it's known as Asia Minor. So here's a map that I've been showing you. This is a map of, these are where all these churches are located. So they're located in pretty close proximity to one another, and they're in the heart of the Roman Empire. So these churches are surrounded by Roman power and wealth and opulence. This area and these cities in particular, these are like big major cities. Centers of Roman imperial power, centers of the Roman imperial cult, where in the first century Roman Empire, people would worship the emperor as divine. And so there was all these temples. These were political places. These were commercial places, economic places. And at this point in time, it's estimated that there's probably only about 7,500 Christians in the entire Roman Empire. And so you have this very small group of Christians in the middle of all of this Roman power and opulence. And the Christians at this time, for the most part, they're poor, they're powerless. So they're trying to figure out, how do we live amongst all of this? And they live under the constant shadow of the threat of Emperor Domitian. Domitian was the emperor. He was in charge. Domitian demanded loyalty. Domitian demanded that you participate in the imperial cult and worship him. But the central confession of Christianity is that there is one true God. The creator God who came to earth in the person of Jesus, died and rose again. That is our God. That is the only one that we worship. And so the very fact that you are a Christian puts you at odds with the Roman reality in which you live. And so Revelation is this letter written trying to help these churches and these Christians figure out, how do we live amongst this reality in which we find ourselves? The word revelation actually comes from the Greek word apocalypse, which means revealing. Revelation at its core, it's revealing something to these churches and ultimately to us that we don't know. Most of the time when we think about Revelation, if you're familiar with it at all, we tend to think of the revealing as it's revealing what's happening at the end of the world. That's what it's letting us know. When all this comes to an end, this is what's going to happen. But actually, if you look at it, that's not what Revelation's revealing. It talks about that. We're going to get there later on in the book. But what's being revealed in Revelation is far more practical to these churches and even to us. The central part of Revelation is chapters 4 and 5. John, who is the author of Revelation, he has this vision, and this vision becomes the foundation for everything else that's going to happen in the book of Revelation. And we looked at chapter 4 last week, the first half of the vision. This week we're going to look at chapter 5, the second half of the vision. But here's how the vision begins. Revelation 4:1. Here's what John sees. Woo! It all just disappeared. We'll give them a second to see if they can get it back real quick. There it is. Good job, everybody. Well done. So this is how the vision begins. After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open into heaven. And so what's actually being revealed is, what is God up to in the midst of all of this? Heaven this is where God lives. That's the way heaven has always been understood. It's the domain of God. It's where God lives. And so for these Christians who are living among injustice and opposition and Roman violence, and that's their big question. It's the same question we ask when we suffer, right? Whenever we see or experience tragedy, we always ask, why, God? Why did you allow this? Where are you? Where are you in the midst of all of this? And so what's being revealed in Revelation is, where is God in the midst of all this? What is God up to? And so in chapter 4, as John is given this peek into heaven, what he sees is he sees God sitting on his throne, and God is surrounded by his royal court, these elders that basically are representative of the people of God. He's got these creatures that are representative of all of creation. So there is God, the creator, sitting sovereign on his throne, and all of creation is worshiping him. So the first thing we're told about, where is God is still God. He's still sovereign on his throne. He is still in charge. And this whole vision is meant as a counter to Rome. Because again, everywhere these Christians look, what do they see? They see Domitian. And Domitian is on the throne. And Domitian has all the power. But the first thing these churches and us are told is, yeah, but that's not the ultimate truth. Revelation's not going to deny the Roman emperor or the Roman emperor's power. But what Revelation is saying is that ultimate authority doesn't reside with Domitian. That God is still king. And God is still in charge. Okay, that's great. But then we get to the second part of the question, but what is he up to? What is he doing? In the midst of all of this violence, in the midst of all of this depression, in the midst of everything that's happening, what is God up to? That's what the second half of this vision is going to be about. That's what chapter 5 is going to be about, is what is God up to in the midst of all of this? And so now that we see God on his throne, here's where chapter 5 picks up. Then I saw, it's John talking, then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. So you have God on his throne, and in his hand is a scroll filled with words, filled with his words. The words of God are what we would call, and what Christians in the first century would call, and even going back before that, their ancestors, the Israelite people, what we would call scripture. All right, when we talk most often about the Bible, one of the words we use for it is, this is the word of God. It's God's words to us, being revealed and communicated to us. So what is in this scroll is scripture. It is the words of God. If you go back into the Old Testament, which Revelation is filled with Old Testament images and pictures. And so if you go back to the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, in the prophets and in the Psalms, there's this idea of a scroll of destiny. And what we mean by a scroll of destiny is there's this scroll that contains the words of God that is essentially God's plan for the course of human history. Where is this all going to go? Where is it all going to end? What's the story that God has written for like the rest of human history? And if you go into, I think it's Isaiah and Ezekiel, they'll talk about how this scroll has been sealed up for the time being. Like that God has this plan for the course of human history that he's going to enact. He's going to lead human history, the world history, the creation history to its true and rightful conclusion. But for the time being, it's sealed up. We don't really know what it is yet. And so here when you get to Revelation, John picks up on this same language, and what you have is you have God holding his scroll of destiny, his words, his plan, if you will, for the unfolding of history and how to bring history to its true and rightful conclusion. But at this point, it is sealed. Emperors a lot of times would seal important documents. You know, sometimes you've seen it where they'll write something up and they want it to be secret except for the person who sees it, so they'll put some kind of seal on it. So that's what we have. We have this scroll of destiny. And the fact that it's covered with writing on both sides is meant to show us how comprehensive and complete this plan of God is. That it's not something God threw together. It's thought out, it's thorough. This is what is going to lead all of creation to its true and rightful conclusion. But for the moment, it is sealed, and that presents a problem. Verse 2, John goes on. He says, and I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll? But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside of it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or to look inside. So now we have a problem that God has this scroll of destiny, but there's nobody that can be found who's worthy to open it, who's worthy to make it happen, right? Enact this and lead history to its true and rightful conclusion. And John says something that is really profound and is actually a really political statement. He says, there's no one on earth or under the earth or in heaven. He mentions all three of these places. So there's no one in heaven, the realm of God, that can make it happen. There's no one in the, what you might call the underworld or hell. The Hebrew word was Sheol, whatever you want to call it, like where dead people go. But John also mentions that there's no one on earth. That is a dig at Caesar. See, this is how subtle like Revelation is it's going to dig at Caesar and Roman imperial power the whole time, but it's going to do it like this really indirect way. Because Caesar, again, we already talked about how central to Roman civil religion was the worship of the emperors, the Caesars. The Caesars were seen as gods. The Caesars were seen as divine. What they were doing was enacting the will of God. But John's like, yeah, not even Caesar can open this. This scroll of destiny where God is leading human history, the true and rightful conclusion, Caesar can't even do it. There's no one. And so what happens in that moment is John feels this sense of powerlessness and almost hopelessness. And he breaks down crying because there's no one that can open these seals and enact this plan. See, this is where Revelation begins, honestly, is it begins with this sense of powerlessness. And this is something these early Christians would have felt. Again, you're talking about 7,500 Christians total in this empire, which I think that represents like 1/100% of the population of the empire. This is a powerless, poor, marginalized, persecuted minority that has no hope of doing anything on their own. See, one of the reasons I think we struggle to understand Revelation is because most of us don't understand true powerlessness. We've existed in this reality where we've been privileged and we have power and we continue to fight for power, and we still think that, like, what can we do? Like, what are we doing to help God do everything that he needs to do? See, these Christians understood, there's nothing I can do to help God do whatever he needs to do. I'm powerless. This is a desperate situation. Understanding Revelation begins with like putting ourselves and having that mind frame. That what's going on is so much bigger than me. I don't have it within me. We don't have it within us to make this happen. No matter what we do, creation is still going somewhere that we don't want it to go, and we're powerless to stop it. When you begin to like accept and recognize his powerlessness, this is when Revelation begins to make sense. So John has this moment of powerlessness and of anxiety or fear or even of hopelessness of what's going to happen, because there's no one who's worthy. But fortunately, not all is lost. Verse 5, as he's crying, as he's weeping, then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." So in the midst of John's powerlessness and hopelessness, he's told by one of these elders, these like priestly people that are around the throne of God in heaven, don't cry, because there is one. And the language that's used is used to describe Jesus. This is all language. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's a descendant of the tribe of Judah, one of the tribes of Israel. He's from the line of David. But what's really interesting is it's clearly a description of Jesus, but the phrases that it's using to talk about Jesus are Old Testament messianic military phrases. That's the language. And what's really interesting about Revelation is Revelation is going to use a lot of military language, a lot of militaristic language, but it's going to completely subvert it. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But what's important for us to understand is what's described here is, hey, there is one. There is one who can break these seals and who can lead history to its true and rightful conclusion. And it is Jesus. And the reason that Jesus is worthy is because he's triumphed. Okay, put a bookmark in that, because we're going to come back to that. That's going to be hugely important. But all that matters now is Jesus is the one that can do it, and the reason he can do it is because he has triumphed. And so now what we're going to come to is we're going to come to what is really the defining image of the book of Revelation. This is the image that's going to drive the whole rest of the book and the message of the book and the heart of the book. And we have to remember, as it starts with John is told, look, there is one who is able to see. Look, there is a Lion of the tribe of Judah. Look at the Lion. And so John looks, but when he looks, here's what he sees. Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne. So John is told to look at a lion, right? The king of the jungle, big, powerful. But when John looks, what he sees is this image of weakness and of sacrifice. At the center of the heavenly throne, there is a slain lamb. This lamb is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This lamb is the Root of David. This slain lamb is the one that has triumphed. See, at this point, this militaristic, powerful language is kind of completely subverted upside down. Now, Revelation, maybe more than any other book in the entire Bible, is what we would call Trinitarian. And I've said this before if you've been here, if you've been watching, but when Scripture talks about God, it talks about that there is one God. There is one true God, but that God exists eternally in 3 persons: Father, Son, and Spirit. And as Father, he's more recognized as the Creator. As Son, he's the Word of God that comes to earth in the person of Jesus, and Spirit is the presence. And so these three are all one. And I know it's super confusing, and people spend their lives writing dissertations about this, so I wish we could get into it, but we can't get into it here in this environment. But that's the way that God is portrayed. And so in Revelation, God will be talked about as God the Creator, and Jesus the Son, and God's Spirit, and God's presence. And so they'll be talked about kind of individually, but what's true of one of them is true of all of them because they're all God. And so remember, God is on the throne, and now here Jesus is on the throne, standing at the center of the throne. But again, the picture of him is he is a slain lamb. This picture of weakness and sacrifice and service. But what's really interesting is then all the language that's used to talk about how God, in chapter 4, if you go back to chapter 4, which again, remember we said is this image of God the Creator, right? The creator and sustainer of everything, the one who spoke the universe into existence. He's on the throne, and all of creation is worshiping him. Now when you get to this picture of the slain lamb on the throne, the same thing happens. All of creation begins worshiping Jesus, the slain lamb. I'm going to read it. It's a kind of a little bit longer chunk, so you can follow along on the screen. You can just listen. But here's what happens when John looks and sees this slain lamb. It says, encircling the four living creatures, this lamb was encircling the four living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he'd taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, all of heaven, all of creation, fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the people of God. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, because you were slain. And with your blood, you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language, people and nation. You've made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on earth." So in the same way that all of heaven and all of creation worships God, the Creator, now when we're told to draw our attention to what you see as this image of God as the slain lamb in the person of Jesus, all of creation and all of heaven responds the same way with worship, and they sing this new song. And there's this image of this lamb as having these horns. That horns, they're about power, they're about victory, and really the idea of like a horned lamb creature thing actually goes back to other types of writing that came out of persecuted Israel in the time between the Old and New Testaments, and that this was a symbol of victory. And so again, what you have here is you have this slain lamb that is presented as the victorious Savior of the people of God. And this slain lamb is the only one worthy to open the scroll. And what's really important is to understand why. Why is this slain lamb in all of heaven, in all of earth, in all of Hades and the underworld and hell? What is it specifically about the slain lamb that makes them worthy to open the scroll? And the answer, it was said in there, you are worthy because you were slain. That's why. And again, what's super interesting is if you look at this vision, if you go back to chapter 4 and you see God sitting on his throne, is meant as a counter to the Roman image. Because the Romans, you have Domitian, you have the emperor, you have Caesar sitting on their throne, and Caesar's all about power, and Caesar's all about might and military and victory. And so God is presented in chapter 4 in this image that counters Caesar. But the image of the slain lamb is completely polar opposite. But this is what makes the slain lamb worthy. This is the reason the lamb is the one who can lead history to its true and rightful conclusion, because he was slain. And now as Jesus takes this scroll and he begins to open it, he begins to lead history to its true and rightful conclusion, all of creation continues to rejoice. Verses 11 through 14. John says, "Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice they were saying, 'Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise.' Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea. And all of them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. And the four living creatures said, amen, and the elders fell down and worshiped. Now again, try the best you can to put yourself in the shoes of one of these 7,500 Christians who lived in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century, at the time Revelation is written. You are this small, powerless minority of people. You don't have really anyone in positions of influence. You have no hope of ever gaining any kind of like respected status within the empire. You are just this small group of people that is united together in this belief that God, through Jesus, is making the world right. And when John shares this vision, what does he say? He says, thousands and thousands upon 10,000s. And then he gets to the end and he says, all of creation is kneeling down before this slain lamb. Think of how inspiring of a picture that would be if you're one of these small, powerless, persecuted Christians. That you're told that, hey, one day, all of creation will realize and recognize what you do. And in the way that you bow down, one day all of creation will bow down. And it's this image that is designed to like encourage them and empower them. And again, the whole point of it, where the whole crux of how this all makes sense, why Jesus is worthy, why Jesus is the one that can lead history to its conclusion, why all of creation is going to bow down and worship him, is because he was slain. Because he was slain. That's what makes him worthy. That's how he can guide human history. See, again, when you're one of these Christians who lives in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century, when you look around you, all you see is Domitian. And all you see is his power. And all you see is his authority. And all you see is him guiding the Roman Empire, and really, for that matter, the world as those people would have known it, to wherever he wants it to go. And so he wages wars and battles, and he gets rid of people that oppress him, and he organizes his own power. He solidifies himself. And that's all that you see. And that's the world that you know. But what Revelation is communicating is, yeah, that power is real and it exists. Domitian has power. He does. He can do some pretty gnarly things. But Domitian is not the one guiding history to its true and rightful conclusion. Domitian's not the one that's on the real throne. See, I've said this before, one of the themes of Revelation is that things are not always what they seem. And so while it may seem that Domitian is guiding it, he's not. That God is the one sitting on the throne. He is the one guiding the course of human history. And he's doing it through a slain lamb. Now I want to go back. I told you to bookmark something earlier. I told you to bookmark that idea of triumph. And I want to go back, Revelation 5:5. We read this earlier, but I want to put it up here again because this is kind of the crux of this whole thing. As John is looking at the throne, remember he's told to look at the lion. When he looks, he sees a lamb. Here's what he says. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. The reason Jesus is worthy is because he triumphed. Interestingly, if you go back to Revelation 2 and 3, which we looked at a few weeks ago, Revelation 2 and 3 are these letters that are written specifically to these 7 churches. Each of the 7 churches gets its own little section. And the theme of all of those letters is all of those churches are encouraged to triumph and overcome. That Revelation is acknowledging, hey, you find yourselves in the midst of a really difficult time. You live in a really difficult place, a time and place where it is difficult to be a follower of Jesus. You are an oppressed, marginalized, persecuted minority. And the encouragement is, yeah, but triumph, overcome, be victorious. Now, you and I are very, very familiar with kind of the Greek concept of victory. You may be like, I'm not familiar at all with the Greek concept of victory, but I promise you, you're more familiar with it than you think of. Because if you know what this logo is at all, you can put that picture up here. This is what comes from the Greek idea of victory. that the Greek goddess of victory was Nike. That's where it comes from. That's literally what Nike means, victory. In fact, I can't prove this, so don't quote me on this. This is just what I've heard, that Nike is a winged goddess. And someone told me they actually created this logo to like replicate the wing. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. I can kind of see it. But Nike was the Greek goddess of victory. And she was often like a companion to Zeus. And Nike was about really military victories and sports victories. The whole idea of Nike and this goddess was about triumph, and it was about dominance. And it was about defeating your enemies. It was about making them submit, overcoming, conquering. And so Nike was appealed to a lot of times in military and in sports. Sporting events were big, especially under Domitian. Domitian had a big thing with sport. He would build all these things and they'd have all these sporting events all over the empire. In fact, the Colosseum in Rome was, I think, built by his dad who reigned before him. And I think it was finished under his brother's reign. And so sports is a big thing. And so when you beat someone in some kind of sporting activity, when you were able to overcome an enemy on the battlefield, like that's the whole idea of victory in the Greek and Roman. It's triumph, it's dominance. It's standing over your defeated enemy who's bloody and beaten and dead on the ground. That's victory. That's triumph. And what Revelation 5 tells us is Jesus is worthy to open the scroll. Jesus is worthy to lead humanity and creation to its true and rightful conclusion because he has triumphed, because he has overcome, because he is victorious. But then here's the image of his victory. This is a painting from the mid-1600s by an artist named Francisco de Zurbarán. I could be saying that wrong. But it's literally called The Slain Lamb. This is Jesus' triumph. This is Jesus' victory. This is how Jesus is overcoming. This is how God is guiding history to its true and rightful conclusion. See, the language, this is the power of Revelation. The language is all this military victory language. It's all rooted in that Greek idea of Nike and victory and dominance. But then it always takes it and completely subverts it. And says, yeah, but triumph actually looks very different. It's not what we tend to think of. It's not standing over your opponent who's beaten and bloodied. No, actually, triumph is Jesus himself beaten and bloodied and defeated. I have, at times, been critical, if you've been here. I've been critical of the American church. And I want you to know that anytime I ever say that, it's not rooted out of anger, it's not rooted out of resentment. I love the church. I've given my life to the church. Any critique I ever have of like broader Christianity, particularly in our context, is rooted out of hope. The hope that I have of what the church can become, because my belief is that the church is the hope of the world. Jesus created the church and there was no plan B. There was no like, hey, the church is going to be my representatives to the world. They're going to continue my mission. But if that doesn't work out, it's okay because we got this over here. No, the church was it. That was it. These are the people that are going to, and so I have this desire and this passion and for the church to be everything that Jesus created it to be and for us to be the kind of church that Jesus talked about and imagined. And so anytime I may come across as critical, it's not out of hatred for the church. It's not out of anger for the church. It's out of my hope for what the church can become and my frustration of what I largely see. And I say all that because I want you to know where my biggest frustration of the church in our context comes from is that we have abandoned this as our guiding image. The Revelation and the entire New Testament says, this is who Jesus is. This is who God is. This is how God is making the world right. This is what we should be formed to be like. The New Testament talks about being transformed into the image of Jesus. But the context in which we live doesn't form us as Christians to look like this. I became the lead pastor at this church like 10 years ago. And I think about 6 or 7 months after I became the lead pastor at this church, my son, who at the time I think was 7 years old, he was diagnosed with on the autism spectrum disorder. And it wasn't a surprise to Lynn and I at the time. Like there was like signs beforehand, and he'd been in different kind of intervention things, but that's when it like kind of became official. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? He was getting into school at the time. What does this mean for school? How do we navigate that? But honestly, one of the most difficult parts of that whole thing came down to church, because we were like new and we were trying to figure out, hey, what does it mean? I mean, we had been here for 10 years. I was a youth pastor, but what does it mean to be the lead pastor? How do we navigate all of this? And social things for Jeremy are really difficult. They were a struggle. And so we were just trying to figure out, like, what do we do? And one of the first questions we ask is, do we tell people? Like, should we share this with people? Should we be open about it? And initially we were told, don't tell anyone. It's no one else's business. Like you don't need to tell them. So we didn't tell anybody. And it was tearing everything up, because Jeremy would have these meltdowns at church and people would look at us because we wouldn't discipline him. And it's like, well, he's not doing what you think he's doing. And we just got to the point where by the time like a year into my being senior pastor, we were just like fried and burned out, didn't know what to do. And it was like just tearing us all up. So I had got invited to this gathering that is humbly known as the Megachurch Pastors Conference, because it was all pastors of these big churches. And I had been introduced to some of these people beforehand, and Lynn and I thought to ourselves, like, let's go there. Like, these people will at least understand the situation that we're in. These are all pastors. We can talk to them, and maybe somebody can help us out. So it was down in San Diego. So we drove down for a few days, and it was for pastors and their spouses. And so we go down there, and really we went down there because we were like desperate at the time. Like, we needed a lifeline. And so we go down there, and there was all these people, and there was probably 60 pastors and their spouses. And some of the things, would be just the pastors, and the spouses would go do something else. Some of the things were pastors and spouses together, and there was like workshops and seminars, and then you'd go to dinner. And everywhere we went was just Linda and I literally just pouring out, hey, here's our situation. Like, what do we do? And no one cared. Literally, it was just silence, and they'd look at you and go, how big is your church? How many staff do you have? Literally, they cared about the three B's, is what I've heard it. The buildings, budgets, and butts in seats. The 3 B's of church right there. That's all anybody cared about. Literally, the first pastor I ever opened up to, who I considered a mentor, I was like, we're dying here, what do we do? No joke, this is direct quote. Don't tell anyone about your special needs kid because no one cares. That was the first thing I was told. And I was like, okay, this has been a fun friendship, but I'm probably not going to be calling you anytime soon. And so I remember Linda and I driving up from San Diego back here to Huntington Beach, literally in tears, like tears. And I remember that was probably the first time. I was in my mid-30s at the point, actually a little younger 30s. I was like, something seems wrong here. And here's the thing, I would not describe any of those people as mean. They weren't mean, they weren't bad people, they weren't evil. And I walked away and thought, something's off. Like, it's not like, this is not what it should be. When COVID hit, and everything went down with COVID that went down, and there was all the division and the anger, and you had people leaving churches and people criticizing churches. The sad part is, I wish I could say that I was surprised by all of that, but that didn't reveal anything new to me. That was something that I had experienced 10 years before at a pastor's conference in San Diego. That there was something wrong about the formative driving image that was used to shape pastors. And in turn, pastors shape churches, and churches shape Christians. There's this whole industry. You may or may not be aware of it. I know it's pretty common out there now, but there's this whole industry that's blown up around churches. And it's about how to develop pastors, how to develop Christian leaders, and it's all like, none of it's bad, but it's all based around the 3 B's. That's what it's all about. It's all about how do you get more butts and seats, how do you increase budgets, how do you get bigger buildings, it's all of this. And so what I learned really painfully early on, but then was just reinforced to me over the years, is that pastors are not shaped to be this. They're not. This whole industry exists to build pastors as leaders in what Revelation would call the Roman way of being a leader. This is why you get to all these crises and all these failures. And again, I'm not even saying all these failures that you read about of Christian leaders and pastors. I don't think these people are all evil. I'm sure there's some that are, but I don't think most of them are evil. I don't think most of them are bad. It just goes to the question of formation. What are we being formed into? And I'm just telling you, as someone who's been a part in leadership in the American church for like 25 years, the industry of forming pastors doesn't form us to be like this. And so in turn, we don't work to form churches that look like this. And churches then don't form Christians to look like this. See, this is my biggest critique. Sometimes people look at it and go, oh, it's political, it's this. No, it's not. Sometimes it takes the shape of all of these different things, but the core of it is, what is the image that we are being formed into? What does it really mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And what Revelation says is this. Because this is the means by which God is ruling the world. This is the means by which Jesus has become king. This is the means by which Jesus is guiding history to its true and rightful conclusion. And so if we look like anything other than this, what Revelation is saying is we're not being shaped by Jesus. We're being shaped by Rome, or Revelation's actually going to get more hardcore and say, or by something worse, possibly even Satan. That this is the defining image of the book of Revelation. This is Jesus, the slain lamb, the king of the universe, who is making all creation right and is guiding creation to its true and rightful conclusion. And what it means to be the people of God in the Roman world that we live in, or the American world that we live in, or the Nigerian world that we live in, or the Korean world, or wherever we find ourselves living, is that we live like our king. We embody his life. Now, please don't walk out of here and think, Scott hates all pastors, Scott hates all church. I don't. I really, really don't. I don't. There's a lot of great churches. There's a lot of great pastors. But we always talk about how we have this need. There needs to be revival. And all I'm telling you, you pick the word, revival, renewal, whatever. The only way that happens in our context is when we recover this as our defining image. That the slain lamb is king, and what makes him worthy is that he was slain. And in his being slain, he has triumphed, and he has overcome, and he has conquered death. And what we are encouraged to do in Revelation is not to smite our enemies or to throw down pagans, but is to live in the way of the slain lamb, because when we live like this, this is how we triumph. This is what victory looks like. This is what overcoming looks like.